Civil liberties. I'm not alone in believing that civil liberties in the United States is under attack. Obviously, something has changed in the country. The Constitution hasn't changed. What I see has changed is how our government views us as citizens, but I think more drastically and more concerning is how American citizens have come to view themselves.
Welcome to the Miller Center Forum. Our guest today is John Wayne Whitehead. John Whitehead was born in Tennessee. His father was a blue-collar worker who, it is said, loved Westerns about hard-bitten men fighting for justice, hence his name, John Wayne Whitehead. Mr. Whitehead attended the University of Arkansas, then joined the Army for 2 years in 1969, and then, as one newspaper correctly described him, he became a full-fledged pot-smoking, acid-dropping hippie, and then graduated from law school in Arkansas in 1974. Following law school, he worked as a journalist in Little Rock, and he did the first long interview of a young Bill Clinton, who was preparing to run for Congress. And shortly after that, John Whitehead began the practice of law. In 1982, he founded the Rutherford Institute as a nonprofit civil liberties and human rights organization. Many viewed the early Rutherford Institute as an arm of the Christian right. It was especially active in cases involving primary and secondary education, opposing condom distribution in schools, sex education, AIDS prevention education, and the like. More recently, its focus has been on free exercise and free speech cases, which have caused some to view it now as an arm of the ACLU. Rutherford has strongly opposed the USA Patriot Act, has argued in favor of due process for those accused of terrorist activities, and, not surprisingly, has opposed student drug testing. John Whitehead is the author of numerous books. He is well known to the justices of the Supreme Court for the amicus briefs that he has filed in many high-profile cases. But he's perhaps most notoriously known to the general public as the attorney for Paula Jones in her sexual harassment suit against Bill Clinton that led to President Clinton's impeachment by the House of Representatives and trial in the United States Senate. Please welcome John Whitehead. Some of that was true.
Unfortunately, all of it's true, so, I guess. So, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank George Gilliam for inviting me to speak, and it's a pleasure, such an esteemed institution. Today I want to talk about civil liberties. We are primarily a civil liberties organization that's taken a number of views on a number of different subjects, totally nonpartisan. We've sued, I'm an equal opportunity politician suing kind of guy. So, civil liberties. I'm not alone in believing that civil liberties in the United States is under attack. Obviously something has changed in the country. The Constitution hasn't changed. What I see has changed is how our government views us as citizens, but I think more drastically and more concerning is how American citizens have come to view themselves. That has changed. And I'd be very, very honest in saying I don't think we're the people that we used to be. If you go back to the founding of this country, I mean, it was started with a rebellion, people who wrote the Declaration of Independence and gave us all our great documents, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. But most Americans today, as I look around the country, are more like compliant lambs, beguiled by materialism, technology, and a complete ignorance, by the way, of the principles set forth in those great documents that I just talked about. So I don't think the most pressing issue today is terrorism. I don't think it's health care or the economy, which are all really important issues. I think the most pressing issue we face today is freedom. Freedom internally, domestically, and individually. And what I'm really concerned about is that more and more Americans seem to be more accustomed to giving up their rights. So the great threat to freedom as I see it today is not some enemy lurking outside of our borders. It's not Al-Qaeda. I think the real menace that we face is from within. The enemy is us. And I think there's a lesson here. Quoting Salman Rushdie, the great author, he said, "Rome did not fall because her armies weakened, but because Romans forgot what being a Roman meant." As I read, and we do a lot of studying and reading of what people say about government today, more and more commentators are arguing about the fall of the American empire and the idea that the country may collapse into some kind of authoritarian regime. If that happens, it's because Americans have forgotten what it means to be an American. I guess the question is, what did it mean once to be an American? I think those concepts are cogently set forth in that great document that Thomas Jefferson penned, the Declaration of Independence, where he says the foundational idea is that individuals have certain rights, inherent rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which served, that document, in my opinion, as Jefferson argued for a Bill of Rights that should be amended to the Constitution, to our Bill of Rights, which I've often argued is the greatest gift that we ever gave to the world. After Jefferson wrote the Declaration, he actually said that he really added nothing new to, and it was nothing new in the Declaration. He was just reflecting the American mind of the day. The American mind of that day had very revolutionary ideas. We have certain absolute rights that no one, no government, no individual can take away. Not only were they worth fighting for, these rights, but they're worth dying for. Finally, as Jefferson argues in the Declaration of Independence, if the government undermines our rights systematically, as he writes, there is a right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute a new government. So we have a right to resist the government. Jefferson and those who followed him, like Martin Luther King, took it as a rule of thumb that if you're going to get any kind of political process, it's going to come from dissent in times of woe, which I think we're in right now. And as we saw with Martin Luther King, through acts of civil disobedience and otherwise, he changed the face of the United States. But one thing we have to realize today is that America is a fundamentally different country since 9/11. It was changing before then, but 9/11 actually put some speed on the change. What began with the passage of the massive USA Patriot Act, over 340 pages, 270 sections, and 30,000 words, in the fall of 2001 has snowballed into an assault on our constitutional freedoms, our system of government, and our fundamental way of life. Once bold and confident, since 9/11 we have become very fearful. And obviously one of the major forces currently shaping the American psyche is fear. People are afraid of terrorism, they're afraid of crime, people are afraid of their neighbors, and so on and so on. And whether these fears are valid or whether more other eras had more fear than we did, whether they're heightened by the media scrutinizing certain issues, and so amazingly so that we have to turn the TV set to get away from them, or that the government is sending out continuous alerts. The real issue is how we respond to those fears. All it takes is a color-coded alarm from the government to start the masses and the media clamoring for more security. Security, even if it means giving up our rights. I think it must be remembered that governments always overreach. Inevitably, they do so. And if they're not deterred, they will impinge or eradicate freedom. And the danger signs have all been around us. You have a copy of an article that I wrote that I think came out this week, where I talk about the state of the nation. I think Obama's giving his speech next week. I don't think he'll probably talk about some of the things that I talked about in my so-called state of the nation. But these are things that I see that I think impact on our civil liberties. We are living in what some are calling an electronic concentration camp. I hope this is not a new concept to you. Something that I see happening every day. The government is continually amassing massive files on more and more Americans. Everywhere we go, we're watched at the banks, the grocery store, the mall, as we cross the streets. And I think the loss of privacy is symptomatic of a growing surveillance state and growing surveillance carried out by our government. Keep in mind that when you're looking at government programs, government laws, usually it's not the law or program that appears to be so dangerous. But what is really concerning is the potentiality of abuse of laws and programs. And the right to privacy, which I think is symptomatic of what we're seeing happening today and the loss of it, is not clearly defined in our Constitution. It's been left up to the courts and the Congress to find its limits. And obviously the Constitution doesn't talk about wiretaps or surveillance cameras for obvious reasons. And it's fallen to the courts usually to define those areas. But the question I'm most asked when I talk about this subject is, if we've done nothing wrong, why should I be concerned or worried the government is watching me? It seems that in a society where terrorists could be attacking at any moment, every day, that giving up our freedom is the necessary element or exchange for ensuring safety of civilians. I think this is very oversimplistic, and I think it ignores the problems and risks associated with such a deal. Orwell's nightmare of a surveillance state that knew everything about everybody and watched us continually was not only a warning, but I think it's a frightening scenario. First of all, the sheer amount of data that the government now has on individuals is mind-boggling. Under the U.S. Patriot Act, law enforcement officials, no matter who they might be, from the FBI, the CIA, or whoever happens to be doing the investigation, or the new Department of Homeland Security, are entitled to view detailed information, what we would consider innocuous information, such as library records, to find out what we're reading. That happens. Credit card companies have information on exactly how much we spend, where and when, of course, we've been, and what transactions. All information that's easily accessible by the government. Cell phone companies log on every call and every message. More information that the government can get very, very easily, and they do that. The government can now eavesdrop on our phone calls. They can open our letters. They can read your emails. They can track us with satellites. They can follow our movement with a whole host of inventive gadgets, by the way, which are heavily funded by the different intelligence agencies, such as the RoboFly, which I talk about in my book, the Change Manifesto, which is a small flying, looking like an insect. It goes over crowds and actually films them, reports back in live time so they can watch free speech demonstrations. The conclusion is that we are moving into, or it appears that we're moving into, a surveillance state. A case in point is the very powerful, the nefarious, and very secretive National Security Agency. How many people in the room know much about the National Security Agency? Well, you should. The National Security Agency collects an amazing amount of data on average law-abiding citizens. And I guarantee you, many people in this room, there's a file on you at the NSA. They do it on a daily basis. It was recently revealed now that they have a massive computer system that they have built, and it's functional, that sweeps all internet sites continually, trying to find out what average Americans are thinking and doing on their websites, collecting information on us. In other words, they're just snooping to find out what's happening. And the thing is that it's not terrorists that are the main targets, because there's only a few terrorists. It's the average American. Groups like the Rutherford Institute, obviously, and maybe the Miller Center. But I'm not sure, having me here today, you may get, George, you may be the target of the NSA. The next logical step, obviously, in the government's will be attempts to predict and control the populace. In fact, the NSA has developed an artificial intelligence system that's designed to anticipate your every move as a citizen. It collects an amazing amount of information. It's fed into a computer system called Acquaint. It's an acronym for another long name. But the computer detects patterns, predicts behavior. If you've seen the movie Minority Report, Steven Spielberg, very similar to that. In fact, Acquaint's also been compared to Stanley Kubrick's film, 2001: A Space Odyssey, the computer HAL in that particular film. It records everything from cell phone recordings, logs to emails to text messages. I tell people today, if you're text messaging, be very, very careful. To personal information posted on social networking sites such as Facebook, credit card statements, library circulation records, to credit card histories, and so on and so on. This is all collected by the National Security Agency at it's 3 of its base long locations. It's building a huge program, I think, computer project now out. I think it's in Utah, but I'm not sure. One NSA researcher just recently quit and went out through the internet because he said the program was so dangerous, and he was really concerned that it was in the hands. This guy had some moral compunction, that's great. It was in the hands of an organization that basically had no control. You see, the NSA is basically funded by black ops programs, which means taxpayer money that Congress does not have hardly any oversight on. In other words, we don't have representative government. Some have argued that this is in violation of Article 1, Section 9 of our Constitution, which requires the public accounting of all money. Why that's important is we should know what the government's spending money on and why, so we can hold them accountable, we the people. That's the duty of good citizens. If, in our surveillance state, the government can get information on anyone, and it can get it within moments, and we thought they were discreetly protecting it, it might be a different, or tightly controlling it, it might be a different issue. But there are definitely concerns over how this information is shared with, especially private corporations. From cell phone providers to other data mining companies, private corporations are actually now involved with the government collecting data on us. In other words, when you spend money on your credit card, whatever you do, it's collected and passed on into the NSA. In fact, the United States Government Accountability Office just released a report and stated that 4 major governmental agencies, the Justice Department, the Department of Homeland Security, the State Department, and the Social Security Administration, between them spend a minimum of $30 million each year on contracts with private collection agencies, which doesn't sound particularly worrying unless you find out later, as we have, and takes some research, but not all that much, that these corporations do not protect the information that they receive, nor your privacy. In fact, 70% of the U.S. intelligence budget now is spent on private collection agencies that collect information for the government. In other words, our taxpayer money is being spent on snooping on us when we're paying for spying on our records and how we function in society. This raises a real important point, though, because what we're seeing happening is the blurring of the line between private and state enterprises into what some are calling a security industrial state. Once a company has information on an individual, it creates a profile. But I guess the question always happens, what if the profile is obtained by hackers or otherwise falls into the wrong hands? As I show in this book here, very clearly that's happened. If you have a criminal record, your spending patterns, and when I talk about a criminal record, you're talking about running a stop sign, a social security number. These can be used for illegal or immoral purposes. And it was just revealed that there is a big black market trade in personal information on average citizens. So obviously, I've pointed out there's a lot of abuse. The government is collecting all this data on American citizens. The question is, the concerns extend to how the data is stored and who has access to it. It may be one thing for the government agencies, the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, to listen on conversations after obtaining a warrant on some people they suspect of terrorism. The problem we're seeing is that with the technology that they now have in the upper echelons of our federal bureaucracy, is that that's not what's happening. There are sophisticated computers that focus on keywords. If you use the word terrorism in a conversation or a text message, most likely you're keyed and brought into the computer system. I tell people, if you go to a local movie and you don't like it, please don't type into your cell phone or your BlackBerry, "The movie's a bomb." Or don't joke around and say, gee, it'd be fun to be a terrorist, or whatever you might want to say, just goofing around, because you're going to go into a data file of the United States government, and you're going to be profiled. You're going to be watched. There are mistakes made in all this, the data mining. People have shown up to vote. And I show these cases in my book, A Change Manifesto. They can't vote because someone has stolen their identity. They're thought that they have committed a felon. They can't vote. They try to buy a home. They've been given a low credit rating when they can't do that. It takes some years to clean their records up. The FBI has confused registration errors in our database on fingerprints with people. And it takes people years to get off of a criminal record database. And let me tell you, once you go into a Google database in the public domain, it's going to take a long time to get that off your record, and that's happening to people. But there's a fundamental principle undergirding all this about the surveillance idea, and that is that undergirding our criminal law is the concept that we're all innocent until we're proven guilty. What's happened with constant surveillance is this. It's been replaced with a mentality that citizens cannot fundamentally be trusted by the government, that we're all suspects, and that we must be monitored continually for fear that we are perpetually on the brink of committing some kind of crime. So the question we have to ask is this. As this accelerates, and it's going to accelerate, it's going to get worse. I think that you're going to see some of it in your lifetime, and I hope that our citizens are awake enough to see it in the next generation. Can freedom in the United States flourish in an age when you have total surveillance, when every movement, whatever, when you have police showing up to your door, investigating you for some minor offense because you might have did the wrong kind of text message? I think a more important question is what happens when someone resists the encroaching surveillance state. I want you to watch a YouTube video that we do them weekly, the case of Elliot Madison. That'll give you an idea of someone who resisted the surveillance state and something untimely happened.
We mean no harm to you. We don't want to hurt you. We don't want to attack you. We want to stand here as Americans because we know our founding fathers died for this very right. We stand here to express our grievances against our government, which is run by big tech.
The ominous rise of the surveillance state just continues unabated. Any hopes that Obama is going to diverge from what George Bush erected as a police state is waning with each day that passes. The case of Elliot Madison is a good example of what I'm talking about. Elliot Madison is a 41-year-old social worker. He's a self-styled anarchist. He traveled from Brooklyn to Pittsburgh for the G20 summit, where some protesters were there protesting some of the actions of world leaders. Madison allegedly listened into a police scanner, and what he did was he listened to the police scanner, and then he twittered ahead to protesters in the streets in Pittsburgh, helping them to avoid capture by the police or confrontations with the police. Ironically, just a few months earlier, the United States government courageously, I thought, commended the Iranian protesters who did the very same thing. They twittered ahead to protesters. They called it an act of pro-democracy for the world. 1 week later, however, FBI agents and other intelligence agencies swept into Elliot Madison's home and confiscated basically everything he had in his apartment, from books to papers to computer files. They took his DVDs like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which of course is an ominous thing if you think about it, and a needlepoint depiction of the Russian Marxist Lenin. All this over a few tweets to help protesters avoid the police. Madison's tactics are common these days, and what I think it does, it helps with the massive surveillance states, it helps the average citizens level the playing field a little bit so they can engage in their own surveillance and hopefully exercise their free speech rights. During the G20 summits in Pittsburgh, the police were using all kinds of tactics, surveillance and otherwise, from rubber bullets to batons to sound cannons, which can destroy the eardrum and possibly cause aneurysms on protesters to disperse them. And it looks like now the way has been paved for Madison to be charged under the federal anti-riot law, which basically says if you organize people, get in the streets and protest, if it might lead to violence, you're a felon under this particular law. One might wonder what would have happened to Martin Luther King, for example, as he sat in the Birmingham jail and wrote letters out saying people should get in the streets, protest, and do sit-ins. He could have been charged with this same particular law. John Lennon, who wrote a number of songs, including Power to the People, telling people to get in the streets, organize, and protest, could be charged under this very same law. The definitions are so vague under this particular law that any citizen that wants to exercise their First Amendment rights can be charged with a felony. Even I've written over the years, and I encourage people to exercise their First Amendment rights, from 8th graders on up, by the way. Get in front of your school if you don't like what's going on and picket. Get out in the streets. That's what the Founding Fathers did. That's what the 60s protesters did in the Vietnam War. Those are key First Amendment rights. I think the message we're being sent here is, though, that Elliott Madison is not the exception to the rule. If you're going to get actively involved in opposing this particular government or any government in the future, you can be labeled a terrorist or an extremist or one who's violating the anti-riot law. Shortly after the Obama administration came into power, the Department of Homeland Security issued 2 memos where it said basically right-wing extremists and left-wing extremists, from animal rights activists to people who want to disagree with the Obama administration, were extremists. And the words extremist and terrorist in these memos were used interchangeably. These type of actions are not limited to the federal government. Various state police agencies have been monitoring peaceful protesters, grannies in the streets, surveying them, trying to find out what they're doing. So what we've erected basically is a police state. And the key to the future, in my opinion, is this: people getting active. You're going to have to be bold. And when the Elliott Madisons of the world come under attack, we're going to have to defend them, whether we agree with them or not. If not, then the Orwellian thought police are not far away. By the way, I don't agree with Elliott Madison politically, but worth defending. Gives you an idea where we're headed. I think just the way the police look today, and I have a whole chapter in my book on that ominous development. Topically, I'm going to go through a few more issues here and pose some solutions, and then we'll have maybe some questions or comments. As I look at the faltering economy, the monstrous financial deficit, we're in a lot of trouble. There are people who now are talking about the government going belly up or bankrupt. As history illustrates, authoritarian regimes assume power, or more and more power in troubled financial times. We're embroiled in wars around the world in some 180 countries, as we're now, many commentators call the military empire. Terrorism, as some credible people, such as Chalmers Johnson, argue, is a blowback effect of the military empire. In fact, David Walker, former Comptroller General of the United States, issued a report in 2007 wherein he stated there are striking similarities between America's current situation and the factors that contributed to the fall of the Roman Empire. These include, and I'm quoting Comptroller Walker, declining moral values and political civility at home, an overconfident and overextended military in foreign lands, and fiscal irresponsibility by the central government. Shortly after issuing that report, the economy collapsed. This doesn't take into account the $3 trillion we're going to spend in Afghanistan and Iraq. And as I understand, something President Obama said he would not do. He just last week asked for $33 billion more for the so-called surge in Afghanistan. And it doesn't take into account all the innocent civilians killed in those countries, such as Iraq, women and children, the American soldiers' lives, the dismantled families. And the Veterans Administration just released a report a week or so ago that suicides among veterans 18 to 29 years old have dramatically increased because of multiple deployment and overall stress of combat. There's a drastic shift going on in the world. I talk about about in that commentary there that you have at your chairs. I think China, because of they're our largest debt holder, basically. 40% of our foreign debt, over $800 billion, gives them an amazing amount of influence on how we deal with them. And I think it really shows in the way the Obama administration tiptoes around numerous human rights abuses, and China's response when we do say something is basically stick it. I think as national borders begin to dissolve in the face of globalization, and I believe globalization is inevitable, just look, be on guard, because the likelihood of our Constitution, which is the supreme law of this land, will be subverted to international laws, and we're seeing some of that already. One distressing matter in all of this is just the corporate media, which we would hope would be our watchdog and continually inform us about what's going on. They don't do that. On any given morning, it was one morning I was just trying to get the news about what was going on in Afghanistan and the economy. I turned to CNN, they were doing some kind of parade in some local town. I flipped to the Morning Joe show, and they were talking about Tiger Woods. I flipped to Fox, hoping, well, maybe they'll be talking about it, and the three hosts were giggling and tasting yogurt. Funny but scary, because it's difficult to get the news off of television. But most Americans that I talk to feel that whatever's said on television is relevant and important. In the process, Americans have largely lost the ability to ask questions and to think analytically. And I think freedom is going to suffer. And I think a really important point, I think, is that that I see happening. I don't think I've ever seen a more spiritually beaten down country than the United States. We've lost our moral compass. I guess the question would be, can we change our values to reflect something more than technology, materialism, and politics? Martin Luther King thought so. In one of his great speeches in April 1967 at the Riverside Church in New York, he said this, and I got to quote this: "We as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motive, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered." We didn't listen then, and we're not listening today. And our young people are paying the price. If you just look at some of the studies that are coming out, our children are greatly confused. They're exposed to so much information that only used to be the domain of adults, such as sex, drugs, or whatever. A recent 2009 survey by the Prince's Trust found that 1 in 10, at least 1 in 10, and maybe more young people in the United States, high school age and older, see no meaning or purpose to life. Why do we think they drop out mentally, become numbed, often adopt a pessimistic view of the future? According to another study that came out in June 2009, 15% of American teens now say, and it could be higher, these are 7th to 12th graders, believe they will die before the age of 35. And this is linked to what's called risky behavior, such as suicide, illegal drugs, sustaining fight-related injuries, unprotected sex, being arrested by the police, getting off on that, contacting sexually related drugs. There's a professor out of Yale called Anthony Croneman. He lays much of the blame at the feet of colleges and universities. He says when young people enter college, and I'm quoting the professor here, they will find courses devoted to every question under the sun, but there is one question for which most of them will search their catalogs in vain: the question of meaning of life, of what one should care about and why, and what living is for. If children are the living messages we send to a time we will not see, we have to be concerned. Even in the literacy rate, we have to be concerned. The latest study done on literacy in the world among the 17 industrialized nations has America ranked number 10 in literacy, although we spend more per capita, for over $40 billion a year on education. What does this say? Well, if more and more children are young people, not children, young people, future leaders see there's no meaning to life, they think they're going to die before, they don't care, before they're 35. They have a problem with reading and understanding. What does that mean for freedom and the exercise of our rights if they know anything about our history? Now, I guess in concluding here, a long conclusion, is that okay? I don't think it's time to give up. I wouldn't be doing what I do. There are a lot of people I work with, civil libertarians around the country, they haven't given up because there is hope. But it's going to come in us being good citizens, exercising our rights, defending the Elliott Massons of the world, even though we don't agree with them, getting out there and just protesting and giving the government what we should be giving them, our opinion very strongly. But we need to be informed. We need to know our rights. I often say that the most beautiful words to me in the English language are those three words the Constitution starts with. Can anybody tell me? There you go. We the people, which means it's our government. We are the guardians of freedom, but we need to be informed. Now, Thomas Jefferson wrote very clearly that the basis of representative government, of democracy, was informed and educated citizens. Not in science, not in whatever. It was in rights. For Jefferson, pre-university education, I'm quoting Jefferson here, was to, quote, instruct the mass of our citizens in their rights, interests, and duties as men and citizens. As for university education, Jefferson wrote, it was to form the statesmen, legislators, and judges on whom public prosperity and individual happiness are so much to depend. But that's the problem today. Plain and simple, our public schools are fostering civic ignorance, and the facts bear it out. For example, a recent survey of 1,000 Oklahoma high school students revealed that only 3%, I'll say that again, only 3% could pass the U.S. Immigration Services citizenship exam. 93% of foreigners who took the test passed. Only 28% of Oklahoma students were able to identify the Constitution as the supreme law of the land. Even fewer were aware that Thomas Jefferson penned the Declaration of Independence. And believe this, barely 1 out of 4, less than 25% of the students knew that George Washington was our first president. And he's on the dollar bill. On and on and on. And most of them couldn't answer 8 out of 10 questions, a high percentage. There's a number of questions. Well, I went through and picked 10 questions at random. And I want to ask you the questions, but I'll go through a few really quick. Okay. What is an amendment? Can anybody say? A change to the Constitution. What's the supreme law of the land? Well, that's easy. The Constitution. What did the Declaration of Independence do? Taught us to dance, sing. It announced our independence from the British Empire. Name one branch or part of government. That's an easy one, right? Congress, whatever. What are the two parts of the U.S. Congress? We elect a president for how many years? Is it 2, 6, 4? What is the highest court in the United States? The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals? No, U.S. Supreme Court, right? What are the two major political parties in the United States? How old do citizens have to be to vote for president? Is it 10? 22? 18. And who was the first president? What's his name? Up at Mount Vernon, okay? Now, after this, it was revealed that a similar study in Arizona found only 3.5% of high school students could pass the citizenship exam. Then there was a study done of adults, finding that 71% of those surveyed failed the test miserably. Even among those holding a bachelor's degree or above, the pass rate was an abysmal 32%. So what's the result here? What does it say to us? That Americans are awfully, woefully constitutionally illiterate. So what's the solution to what we see happening? All the issues I've talked about. There's no doubt in my mind we have to reconsider the purpose of education, obviously. And our duties as citizens, we have to be informed, we have to inform others, we have to get together, we have to have meetings. The third, and I think really important, we have to stand on our rights. We can't sit idly by. There comes a time when you have to pass up the nights at the gym occasionally. Turn the television set off by all means and get down to your local city council meeting with a sign in your hand if you don't agree. There is no reason why a child in the United States, by the time they have so-called passed to the 8th grade, should not have a thorough knowledge of the Bill of Rights and be ready to exercise them. But not only that, to know how radical some of the founding fathers were, like Thomas Jefferson, who was very much a radical. When the U.S. Patriot Act was first passed and I went through it and read it, one of the first things that came to my mind, man, Jefferson would have been one of the first ones, maybe an enemy combatant. You have to read some of his writings. Pretty radical guy. But the point of all this is that nobody's going to fix the problems except you and I. If you want to help your country, you have to help yourself. There is no reason why you've got your little Bill of Rights pamphlets there. There's no reason. I've spoken to lawyers groups, 150 lawyers crammed in a room about this size. Recently, I spoke to 150 lawyers. I asked them, could any lawyer room give me the 5 freedoms in the First Amendment? Not one could. I won't ask you. Can anybody give me the 5 freedoms in the First Amendment? If you raise your hand, I'm going to call on you. You should.
Assembly, the right to bear arms.
That's the Second Amendment. You just failed. Yeah, but see what I'm saying? You shouldn't be stumbling on that. I mean, how many what schooling do people? Most people have been going to college, sure. I have, in our intern program, we have law students come in the summer, okay? The first question I ask the law students, these are from good schools too, not University of Arkansas, places like I went, but really good schools, high up on the list, like University of Virginia. Give me the 5 freedoms in the First Amendment. I've yet to find one that can. It's pretty scary stuff, folks. The other thing I think we really need to really carefully consider is the emergence of a new kind of politics. One that shies away from the partisan politicking we see today, which makes one political party indistinguishable from the next when it comes to their motivations. I'm urging a nonpartisan constitutionalism in which citizens and politicians base their decisions and morality on the supreme law of the land instead of dividing among party lines. It's become clear to me, as I've been involved in numerous lawsuits in D.C. and have actually done some work on the Hill, that random attacks and infighting between individuals on both sides of the political aisle is precisely what feeds the Washington insider political class and allows them just to move ahead and frame their agendas no matter what citizens believe. In other words, while you and I are arguing about politics, the Washington elite simply does what it wants. Where the founders once espoused the ideal of government by the people and for the people, we now have government by the elite against everyone else. So we need to rally together and get away from partisan politics. It's destroying the country, in my opinion. So, in conclusion, America was born out of sheer grit, determination over the years by great men, stretching from Jefferson to Thomas Paine to Martin Luther King. Even people like Elliot Masson are willing to go to jail because of what they believe. It doesn't matter what you're getting out here to take a stand. You have to take a stand. It doesn't matter if it's the economy, the environment, restrictions on your free speech, or something else. What matters is you do your part. And I love to quote the great revolutionary firebrand Samuel Adams, who said this, and I'm going to end on this quote. It does not require a majority to prevail, but rather an irate, tireless minority keen to set brush fires in people's minds. I hope I'm not a minority one tonight. Any questions? Thank you very much.
Mr. Whitehead, you've correctly identified the lack of moral compass in our country and as a problem in our lack of community. You have warned about Christians, quote, who try to make their faith a hybrid political religious philosophy.
Yeah.
And you've advised them to be careful not to make their politics their religion. When should Christians or the devout of any faith become politically active, and in which areas should their faith inform their politics?
Whoa. Anyway, I was a staunch opponent of the Christian right. I don't think politics, to be honest with you, politics and religion don't mix very much, unless it's a politics of speaking truth to power. Maybe that's how I'd answer that. Once we align with parties, and I've argued with people on the left, that once it becomes my candidate, right or wrong, human rights loses out. So that's basically how I'd answer that. Maybe it needs a more detailed answer, but I don't think politics should ever trump religion, human rights, or whatever. If President Obama is wrong on issues, and he's wrong on numerous issues, his civil liberties record so far is not very good, you speak out about it. Whether you like the man or not, it isn't attacking the man. George Bush, the same. Bill Clinton, whoever. So I would say that politics should never trump faith, religion, human rights. Never, 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 never. That should always come up. It's the great Martin Luther King statement. I love you. I'd rather die than hate you. We got to care about people. That's the main issue. And I think that's where we're losing today. Yes, sir.
The Supreme Court yesterday decided a rather significant First Amendment case that's likely to have impact on national and state elections. I wonder if you'd comment on that.
I have not read the case, but I don't like what I read. No, I don't think corporations should have rights like people. No, they're not persons, and there are constitutional experts that would disagree with me. I know the courts have ruled that. Whether that's a First Amendment issue, I have dire doubts about that. I think what's going to happen is it's going to put an amazing amount of power in large corporations. It's going to take the right of us to control our representatives out of our hands even further. That's going to be the dire consequences. And there's been a number of good articles in the New York Times, by the way, if you have not read them, that really analyze these issues, and I would agree with what the New York Times is saying.
I'd like to know your view of the relationship between economic freedom and political freedom.
Could you define your question more?
Are the two separable? If you have a free economy, do you have to have free politics?
I don't know if you have to have it, but I would want a free economy, and I'd want whatever free politics means. Yes, I think you have to have a free economy. I think the more the government becomes involved in the economy, especially as the government grows into what I'm arguing, and not only just me, a surveillance state, the more dangerous it becomes. Because as you look at history, most of the authoritarian regimes came into power when the government took over private enterprise during troubled times, from the Bolshevik Revolution to Hitler coming to power. I'm not saying that's going to happen in the United States, but does that answer your question?
Question of instruction. Recently I applied, I had a credit report, and there was something on it, the 22 pages they sent back that I questioned, and there was a phone number. I called the phone number and said, this issue is wrong, I'd like to talk with someone about it. And the conversation with this young lady, I asked, what is your nationality? Are you a U.S. citizen? She said, no, I'm not. I said, where are you? She said, I'm in Indonesia. All of the information, 22 pages, every account that I have
Was in a foreign country.
was in a foreign country in the hand of a foreign national. How do you protect your rights when it's being disseminated outside of...
They're not being protected. As I was going to talk about and get to, what we really need is some really stern laws that protect information and protect how it's disseminated, protect what these private data mining companies, which basically are operating outside the country, we don't have those protections. So they're not protecting the consumer. So again, it goes back to what I'm saying. If we want that change, we're going to have to start targeting our representatives on those issues. That's a very good question. How do you protect your rights? Data information. To be really honest with you, it's going to be very, very difficult because the technology we see operating today is basically out of control. It's become almost autonomous. It's so huge and so large, I don't even think the National Security Agency can control the computers they have. Think about it for a second. I have a BlackBerry and it talks to me. If I have a BlackBerry that talks to me, what do they have? That's why they're comparing, some researchers, the Acquaint system with HAL. How many people have seen 2001: A Space Odyssey, where the computer thing? Well, you realize back in the early 1980s, they started developing computers that talked and played chess. How much more sophisticated do you think they are now? And we just don't know. So I think with systems like Acquaint, it may be virtually impossible. In fact, I'll take the virtually out of the sentence to protect information. So what does that mean? That means we moved into a new environment, an environment in the sense of that which surrounds us. Again, I was a big fan of Marshall McLuhan, who said many years ago, the medium is the message. What is the message of a system called Acquaint? Is that we can't get away from being watched and cataloged and controlled. What does the future hold? It's very, very scary, is what I'm saying. So, can we get laws? Sure, there's a law on the books, the 1974 Privacy Act, which says the government cannot collect data on citizens like this. So what do? They hire private companies to do it. They get around the law.
Or non-nationals.
Yeah, non-nationals. So President Obama just issued an executive order several weeks ago where he made, again, this is how government operates. I first saw the executive order. I didn't know what in the world it meant, but it talked about Interpol. It took, I have a British attorney in the office. It took him a week to figure out exactly what was going on. But what happened was, in this order, by mentioning semicolons and subsection 2C, we had to go read all the law, President Obama established Interpol, which is located, by the way, in the U.S. Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. office, as an autonomous agency on American soil, not under the real law, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, or any federal law. A number of conservative bloggers were writing on it, and I thought a little too extreme, but I looked at it kind of, I thought rationally, but we're seeing that. In other words, Interpol is going to be on American soil. They'll have access to information. They're now erecting what they're calling a Euro-CIA in Europe. They'll be connected to that. So information they collect on American citizens is obviously going to be shared because it's all shared between the CIA, the FBI, and the local police now. Your local police are connected into the intelligence network, which means is getting away from people knowing in foreign countries and data is going to be virtually impossible. So what does that say to us? We really got to be on our toes. When you leave here tonight, you should go home. Well, if you don't read this book, go to my website, because we write on this continually. Research, read, know. Get the people together, and a movement should start. You don't have to be Tea Party people to get out to meetings. I don't think there are any Tea Party people here. I don't want to make you mad, but that's fine. I like Tea Party people. I like anybody out there doing it. I don't always agree with everything everybody does, but you got to get involved. So that's what we're being. The wake-up call is here. It's way beyond the wake-up call from what we're seeing happening. We're in a real tough bind, folks. Yes.
I'm wondering, at the beginning, you quoted Rushdie, and you made several references to the fall of the Roman Empire and the possibility that the U.S. might be in some sort of decline and something bad might happen, and as well as the decline of morals. And I'm wondering, the Roman Empire, was built on military strength and the backs of huge amounts of slaves, 100,000 slaves they take at a time.
Yep.
And the U.S. has, a lot of our prosperity is based on military actions and things we've done, governments we've toppled in order to access resources in various areas.
There are many people who disagree with that, but go ahead.
Okay, well,
Prosperity doesn't hang on that now.
Well, the question is, whether you think the prosperity can come without those sorts of things, whether, when we went into the Philippines and, killed a large percentage of the population after the Spanish left, when we put in the Shah in Iran and similar things, so CIA actions in various places, that have led to prosperity. And the fact that, in the beginning you said, we the people instead of we the elite. But it was the elite at the beginning, was it not?
Who's the elite you're talking about?
the founding fathers. They were very limited, right, who could vote. And I would say, my question is, could America have been founded if the principles in the Constitution were being applied to more than a select group of people? Could the land have been taken from Native Americans? And when was the time that you think was the golden age of these principles, when it was applied to more than a select group?
I think the golden age has been here and there. It depends on how the people exercise the rights. The thing about Jefferson, Franklin, the people who drafted the Constitution. I'll go back. The Constitution, by the way, is a very sterile document without the Bill of Rights. If we hadn't had the Bill of Rights added to it, without the writ of habeas corpus is in the body of the Constitution, a very important right, which George Bush attacked systematically, the right to be brought out of jail and brought before a judge. It would have been a very sterile document. And you're right, there were elitists involved in writing the Constitution, but there was a groundswell. I mean, Jefferson said it, when he finished writing the Declaration of Independence, he said, I just put down what people were thinking during the day. And it wasn't just the elite, it was the people out there in the colonies or whatever. Government is always going to be exercised by some kind of elite. That's the question. Do you want that elite to be Jefferson and Washington and Franklin or whoever and Alexander Hamilton? Or do you want it to be the military or whatever? I think that's your choice. That's the choices we have to make. Golden ages, I think the founding of America was a golden age of somewhat. But do I think America's in decline? I mean, everybody I read thinks that, okay? Whether it's a slow decline, a quick decline. Chalmers, Johnson, you've read his books? Great historian. His books mainly focus on the fact that we are definitely in decline. I would agree that we are in decline. The question is, can we pull ourselves out of decline? Rome went ahead and proceeded on a military empire and did collapse. Great Britain pulled back and saved their democracy, okay? Can we do that now? I don't know. See, there's so many complicating factors. All the factors I talked about, the debt, and the surveillance state. Globalization is inevitable. With electricity, it was inevitable we were going to be a globalized state, not a global village. I think Brzezinski's right. It's not a global village. It was more like a large global city with all the agitations, the ghettos, and blah-da-da. And that's what we're in right now. So I hate to say golden ages. We wouldn't want to go back to 1776, and that's what I'm saying here tonight. Why go back to 1776? Take the principles of the great principles. I mean, we can't argue against the great principles in the Bill of Rights. And as I pointed out, the Constitution basically approved of slavery. That's wrong, okay? I mean, but gee, we got the Bill of Rights. Let's take them and run with them and make our own golden age. We can do that. I believe it. I'm optimistic in that sense, but only if you come here and watch me speak tonight and go home and watch Jeopardy or whatever you watch, we lose.
Yes, sir. I know that you talked about government almost always will take more authority than it should.
It's inevitable, yeah. History shows that, yeah.
Suppose I would propose this to you, that not only would government do that and hoodwink the people for its self-preservation and more power, suppose there's an elite that is actually along the lines of some conspiracy researchers where some of this activity is not just the decay of America, the decay of freedom, but an actual deliberate creation to destroy America. One example I'm going to say would be this secret meeting between President Bush and the President of Mexico and Canada to create an American Union.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't too secret. It wasn't a conspiracy. They were doing it out in the open. So it was well known. Yeah, I think there's always conspiracies. There are people who have a lot of self-interest. But to be honest with you, I've had a really neat experience of being able to have some discussions with someone who worked in the CIA for 24 years. And I asked him enough about, and this was a semi-hitman probably, he won't say. But I asked him about all the conspiracy theories. His conclusion was, and this is 24 years at the top of the level of the government, he said he thinks that most of the people in government are pretty good folks, but they're so completely bungling. idiotic most of the times, that to formulate a large conspiracy is incomprehensible. Now, what he did say was that there are small groups within the government that do conspiratorial things. They want to take power of this, take over this, destroy the American government. I'm not sure they want to do that. I think what I see happening is just amassing of power. Obama's doing the same thing, unfortunately. Obama surprised a lot of folks. He's not doing anything really different than George Bush. He's just continuing to amass power in the executive. That's a really dangerous trend. Will that destroy America as we know it? Yes, eventually it will. It connected to the surveillance state, whatever. Yeah, so do people want to push their agendas? Obviously. And whether you call it a conspiracy or not. I'll be honest with you, George Bush's 8 years, whether you're a Republican, you can disagree with me on this, was catastrophic. So, and I'm afraid, again, civil libertarians I work with on the left are really concerned about Obama. He's continuing that trend. It's going to get worse. Unless, and the big unless is what we do about it. Yes, sir.
Our closing question comes from Robert O'Neill, who served as president of the University of Virginia and now directs the Thomas Jefferson Center for the Protection of First Amendment.
Thank you, George. I should stop there. That suffices. John, this may come under the heading of Fox News tasting yogurt rather than commenting on things that you had hoped they would.
Yeah.
I wonder if you'd say a bit more about the surprising, disturbing indifference of the major news media, even to issues, challenges, threats that directly affect them. Let me give just one example from this past week. Granted, this was a tough week in terms of news. There was lots going on. But two really significant and positive developments. One was the State Department's decision finally to grant visas to two controversial but eminently respected international scholars, Tariq Ramadan and Adam Habib, after years of stonewalling and stalling and refusing even to provide information. The other was Senator Leahy's lashing of the FBI director, unfortunately a distinguished graduate of our law school, but so be it, over the abuse, shocking abuse of national security letters, one of those information gathering practices to which you referred.
Tool. I can talk about this.
Now, even in a busy week with lots else going on, somehow you would expect that developments as significant as those two would have got a good deal more attention than they did. Just to add to the illustration, the story about the visas did appear in the print edition of the New York Times on, I think it was Thursday, but curiously could not be found in the online edition. Now, maybe that's just a technical glitch or oversight, but it does cause me to wonder what your thoughts are on the indifference of the major media, even where their own interests are at stake.
One of our speakers in our summer intern series is a fellow named Jay Brannigan, who was the White House Time correspondent during the Clinton administration. We became friends. Jay speaks basically on the death of journalism, and he's absolutely correct, I think. Investigative reporting is basically dead, so that's why you don't get news. News medias are owned by corporate entities that are driven by the profit motive, which means you have to stay glued to the TV set, which means that they want to titillate you with celebrity news, yogurt tasting. I wrote an op-ed piece where I critiqued Glenn Beck. I didn't go after Glenn Beck, and the fellow who helped me research is saying right here, one of our students. I got bombed by people. It was amazing, but what's that?
Use that word, bomb.
Yeah, there you go. But I don't know what I was going to say on that issue, but here's the point what I find. Yeah, it's very difficult to get the news. How do you get the news? You won't get it off of television, mainly. You'll have to watch an awful lot of TV to get it. And that's going to take a lot of your time. You have to go to the internet. You have to go to good websites like we have. We post a lot of information. We try to post information that you don't get in so-called news. It's just like the creation of the Interpol agency. None of the major news media carried it, none of the TV people. The New York Times didn't even report on it until some conservative bloggers started talking about it. They didn't even cover it as a news article. They didn't consider it important. Or they did not know about it. That's the point. Because a lot of things the government does is quite obscure. Like I said, the Obama executive order was difficult to get through and understand. It took a while. It was so obscure, which says bad, and they didn't do a press release when they issued it. So you didn't know what was going on. So the only way you're going to get news today is from the internet, reading good books, staying totally alert, and you're not doing it for yourself, by the way. You're doing it for the next generation of kids, whom a lot of kids I talk to go, what? They don't know what's going on. So, and what I say with the Bill of Rights pamphlet, if the school's not going to teach the Bill of Rights, take your pamphlet and give it to your grandchildren, your children. Teach it to them in the home. But how are you going to get the news? You're going to listen to the radio, on the internet. You're going to have to become responsible citizens. That's the problem. As I said in my opening, the enemy's not terrorists. It's not somebody outside the borders. It's us. We're the enemy. As Rushdie said, you know, we've Rome collapsed because the Romans forgot what it meant to be a Roman. I think we've forgotten what it means to be an Americans. And one last thing here. We got to look at the schools. I mean, we've started in the mid-1990s finding zero tolerance policies where kids are thrown out for having alcohol self-serve, suspended from school. And there's a rigid conformity being promoted in schools where people are not allowed to think very well or to protest or exercise their rights. I've had students from the high schools come over and meet with me saying, I have no rights. These are kids that are thinking. So we have a whole generation of young people coming up that see no meaning to life, pessimistic about the future. So boy, we have a lot of work to do. And it's going to take people like us to do it. Or I think Richard Dreyfuss said it really well. And George, I got to meet Richard because he likes my civic education stuff. I saw him in the Bill Maher show. He said, if we don't teach civic education, if we don't start teaching to the young people, it's over, folks. And you know something? I agree with Richard Dreyfuss. Thanks.
John Whitehead is president of the Rutherford Institute.